It began not with the roar of engines, but with a telegram. In 1940, Britain was running out of time. The Battle of Britain had left the Royal Air Force bloodied and desperate. German bombers were burning London, and the Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons that defended the island were being worn down faster than British factories could replace them. They needed fighters, hundreds of them, and they needed them now. Across the Atlantic, a young American company called North American Aviation saw an opportunity. They had never built a fighter before. But when a British purchasing commission arrived in California asking to license build the American P-40 Warhawk, North American's president, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counteroffer. We can design you a better fighter from scratch in 120 days. It sounded insane. No one designed a modern combat aircraft in 4 months. But the British, too desperate to hesitate, agreed. And so, in the fall of 1940, the Mustang was born, not as a symbol of American power, but as a British emergency project. The man tasked with making that impossible deadline was a German immigrant engineer named Edgar Schmude. He was short, sharp, and obsessed with speed. As a young man, he had watched Luftwaffe prototypes take shape in secret hangars. Now, working in Los Angeles under the California sun, he vowed to build something faster, something sleeker. He drew through the night, cigarette smoke curling above the blueprints. His pencil traced a revolutionary wing, laminar flow airfoil, razor thin, designed to cut drag like a knife. Beneath it, a long fuselage that seemed to promise speed even when standing still. When the prototype NA-73X rolled out onto the runway on October 26, 1940, it looked like it had arrived from the future. The test pilot, Vance Breeze, opened the throttle. The Mustang surged down the runway and lifted smoothly into the morning sky. It flew beautifully, elegant, fast, balanced. And yet, it wasn't perfect. The Mustang's engine, the Allison V1710, could not breathe well at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, it gasped for air, losing power rapidly. It was a brilliant airframe shackled by a mediocre heart. For the British, who needed high-altitude interceptors to fight German bombers, it was a fatal flaw. But at lower altitudes, the kind used for ground attack and tactical support, the Mustang was astonishing. It could fly fast, low, and steady, hugging the Earth at 400 miles per hour. Someone in the U.S. Air Forces took note. By 1941, America was inching toward war. The Army Air Corps, soon to become the U.S. Army Air Forces, needed a fighter bomber, something that could carry bombs and dive straight into enemy positions. Their existing aircraft, like the A-24 Dauntless and the A-25 Shrike, were slow and outdated. Then a quiet proposal came across a desk at Wright Field. Modify the British Mustang to carry bombs, add dive brakes, reinforce the wings, give it teeth. The engineers got to work. They cut into the elegant Mustang's wings and installed hydraulically operated dive brakes, rectangular metal panels that would pop open during a steep dive to keep the aircraft stable. Under its wings, they fitted mounts for 2 500-pound bombs. The guns, 6.5 caliber Brownings, stayed exactly where they were. The result was a strange hybrid, half fighter, half bomber. The Army gave it a new name, A-36 Apache. To many pilots, it looked wrong. They mocked it as the Mustang that forgot how to climb. Others called it the slowest fast plane in the Army. But a handful of test pilots saw something more. During its first dive tests at Muroc Dry Lake, today's Edwards Air Force Base, the A-36 revealed its true nature. As it tipped forward into a dive, the pilot deployed the dive brakes, and the aircraft began to scream. Air tore through the metal vents on its wings, producing a high-pitched, bone-shaking howl that echoed across the desert. It wasn't mechanical. It was primal, a banshee wail that seemed to announce death itself. When the bombs hit, the earth shook. The A-36 had found its voice. The Army brass, initially skeptical, suddenly leaned forward.
The Mustang's low-altitude stability made it the perfect dive bomber. It could strike targets with precision and pull up faster than a Stuka. It could also outrun most enemy fighters below 10,000 feet. The U.S. ordered 500 aircraft immediately. But there was no glory waiting for the A-36. It was never meant to be glamorous. Its mission wasn't to duel in the sky. It was to fly low, to dive straight into flak, to hit bridges, trains, and tanks, and to fly home through smoke and tracer fire. It was a dirty, dangerous job, and the men who flew it would soon learn that every scream of its brakes carried a price. By early 1943, the first squadrons, the 27th and 86th Fighter Bomber Groups, began receiving their new planes. The name Apache never stuck. The pilots preferred something simpler, something rawer. They called it the Screaming Apache, or sometimes just the Screamer. Training began at fields across the American South. Pilots practiced steep 70-degree dives, releasing bombs at barely 2,000 feet above the ground. Many were terrified. A few crashed during training. But the survivors learned quickly. Trust the brakes, trust the speed, and never lose your nerve. One instructor told his students before their first dive, "When she starts screaming, don't pull out. Let her talk. That scream means she's alive, and so are you." As spring turned to summer in 1943, the A-36s were crated and shipped across the Atlantic. Their destination? North Africa. There they would join the Allied advance into Sicily, the first step towards liberating Europe. No one knew what to expect. The Luftwaffe still ruled the Mediterranean skies. The flak guns were waiting. The ridges of Sicily were lined with German and Italian defenses. The A-36 would meet the enemy for the first time and prove in blood and fire that even the low-flying Mustang could strike terror into the heart of an empire. The Germans would laugh at first. Then they would hear the scream.
The dawn over the Mediterranean on July 10, 1943, looked deceptively peaceful. The sea was calm, the sky brushed gold with the first light of morning. But beyond the horizon, the largest invasion fleet in history up to that point was closing in on the island of Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied bid to tear open Hitler's southern fortress. Among the endless convoys of landing craft, cruisers, and destroyers, another sound began to rise, the throaty rumble of Allison engines. Over the blue water, their shadows flickered like ghosts. It was the debut of the A-36 Apache, and the enemy was about to meet America's low-flying Mustang for the first time. The 27th and 86th Fighter Bomber Groups had been stationed for weeks in dusty airfields across Tunisia, waiting for the order to strike. Their planes, newly assembled, still smelled of paint and oil. Their noses bore names scrawled in white chalk: Lil Joe, Tucson Terror, Arizona Kid. Their mission was simple, brutal, and suicidal. Fly low, dive hard, destroy anything that moves. The German and Italian troops dug into the Sicilian hills, didn't take the report seriously. To them, these new aircraft looked clumsy. Big radiators hanging under their bellies, fixed bomb racks, and those strange metal flaps on their wings. Rumors spread among Wehrmacht units. It's just a slower Mustang. It won't last a week. They were right about one thing. The A-36 wasn't fast enough to run from a fight. But it wasn't built to run. It was built to scream. On the morning of July 11, 1943, a squadron of A-36s from the 86th Fighter Bomber Group roared into the air from a dusty strip near El Hawaria, Tunisia. Their target? German gun emplacements near Licata, on Sicily's southern coast. At 10,000 feet, the formation leader, Captain Charles or Chuck Kagelman, spotted the smoke of battle below. He rolled his plane over, pushed the nose down, and opened the dive brakes. Instantly, the sky filled with a banshee wail, a metallic howl so piercing that the men on the ground froze. German soldiers looked up, confused, as the sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to tear the air itself apart. Then the bombs fell.
two 500-pounders slammed into the German positions with terrifying precision. Sand, steel, and bodies erupted in every direction. The rest of the squadron followed, one after another, howling from the clouds, releasing their loads at near vertical angles. A German artillery officer later described it in a captured report. They came out of the sun, screaming like devils. The sound froze our men in place. Then the world exploded. The first week of fighting was chaos. The weather was brutal. Blinding dust storms on the airfields, searing heat in the cockpits. The A-36s flew up to 6 missions a day, attacking columns of German armor and troop convoys trying to reach the front. Their accuracy stunned even their commanders. Where heavy bombers missed by hundreds of yards, the A-36s could drop a bomb within a few meters of a target. Bridges vanished, fuel depots erupted, and entire convoys were shredded before they reached the coast. But the price was high. Flying at barely 2,000 feet, the A-36s were easy prey for German 20mm flak guns. Every mission meant running a gauntlet of fire so dense it turned the sky black. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Walsh, described his first mission in his diary. "You dive straight into hell. You hear the wind start to scream. The plane shakes. Tracer rounds reach up for you. You drop, pull, and pray the wings stay on. If you make it out, your hands are bleeding from gripping the stick." The A-36 earned its reputation the hard way, through the courage of the men inside it. During one mission near Palermo, a flight of A-36s was tasked with destroying a heavily fortified hilltop battery that was blocking the Allied advance. The first 2 dives missed. The third pilot, Lieutenant Michael Russo, refused to pull up. He held the dive until 1,500 feet, dangerously low, and released his bombs directly into the bunker. The explosion vaporized the target and nearly tore his aircraft apart. Russo limped home, his fuselage shredded by flak. His commander later called it the most accurate dive I ever saw. Months later, Russo would become the only A-36 ace of the war, proof that the slow, low Mustang could still fight like a true predator. As the battle for Sicily raged, German troops began to change their tune. At first, they mocked the Apaches. By August, they called them der Schreien der Tod, the screaming death. The sound of those dive breaks, that unearthly shriek, became psychological warfare. Allied ground troops even learned to recognize it. When they heard the scream, they cheered, knowing bombs would soon be falling on the enemy instead of them. In one report from the U.S. 7th Army near Messina, a radio operator wrote, "We could always tell when the A-36s were coming. You'd hear that wail, high, metallic, like a whistle from hell. Then the German guns would go quiet." But victory in Sicily came at a terrible cost. Of the first 500 A-36s built, nearly 150 were lost, most to anti-aircraft fire. Pilots joked grimly that A-36 stood for always dive, sometimes 36 come back. Yet for every plane that didn't return, dozens of Allied soldiers on the ground survived because of their precision strikes. The A-36 had proven itself beyond question. It could fly low, strike hard, and terrify even the most disciplined enemy. By late August 1943, the Allies had taken Sicily. The road to mainland Italy was open, and the screaming Apache had earned its place in the sky. After the campaign, a German prisoner was asked what he thought of the new American dive bomber. He hesitated, then said quietly, "When we heard that sound, we stopped shooting. We prayed." That sound, the howl of air through the A-36's dive breaks, would soon echo across Italy, from Naples to Monte Cassino. The Mustang that couldn't climb had just changed the way America fought a war. By the fall of 1943, the war had moved north, across the narrow Strait of Messina, onto the rugged spine of Italy. The land was treacherous. Mountains, valleys, and rivers carved the country into a natural fortress.
The Wehrmacht had turned every hill into a bunker, every bridge into a trap. The advance of the Allies stalled again and again under the weight of German artillery. And then the sky began to scream. The A-36 Apache had crossed into Italy with the men of the U.S. Fifth Army. Their mission was brutal in its simplicity: support the troops, destroy the roads, and make life impossible for the German 10th Army retreating north. The A-36s operated from rough airfields carved out of olive groves and vineyards. Their runways were little more than dirt strips, lined with fuel drums and canvas tents. Maintenance crews worked with mud up to their ankles, patching bullet holes with scrap aluminum and hope. But when the engine started and the propellers spun up, all of that vanished in a roar of power. The pilots strapped themselves into cockpits still smelling of oil and sweat, wiped the dust off their gun sights, and looked east, toward the Apennine Mountains, toward the enemy. Each flight carried 2 500-pound bombs, 8 rockets, and 6 50-caliber machine guns, enough firepower to erase a village or silence a hill full of mortars. October 1943, the Battle of Salerno. The Germans had dug in along the Volturno River, pouring fire on the Allied beachheads. Every advance was answered by machine guns hidden in stone walls and by tanks moving through vineyards. The order went out: call the Apaches. At dawn, 12 A-36s from the 27th Fighter Bomber Group lifted off into a sky already thick with smoke. They flew low, too low, under the cover of the morning haze. From above, they could see the flashes of gunfire along the riverbanks. Their leader, Captain Charles Henley, gave the order: open brakes, go screaming. The howl filled the valley. Civilians in the nearby villages later said it sounded like the sky itself was crying. German soldiers called it the death whistle. Then came the explosions, precise, violent, and merciless. Henley's squadron bombed the German supply columns into fragments. Trucks burned, horses scattered, tanks sat immobilized in the mud. By mid-afternoon, the German line broke, and the U.S. 36th Infantry surged forward. A message from Ground Command read simply, "Your Apaches just won us 3 miles of Italy." In the following months, the A-36 became the hammer of the Mediterranean. They flew hundreds of sorties a week, destroying bridges, railroads, and communication centers. They developed a terrifying reputation for accuracy. Dive angles as steep as 70 degrees allowed them to place bombs within yards of targets. Allied soldiers joked that the A-36 could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. Even the Germans begrudgingly agreed. A captured Wehrmacht officer near Naples told his captors, "If you hear them scream, it's already too late." But every success carried a cost. A-36 pilots flew closer to death than most airmen. They attacked in daylight, in plain sight, diving straight into fields bristling with 20mm flak. Their engines took punishment that would tear lesser planes apart. Their dive brakes, when damaged, sometimes locked in place, sending the aircraft plummeting uncontrollably into the ground. In a single month, the 86th Group lost 30 aircraft. Many pilots never returned. Their last act, a perfect dive and a perfect hit. One pilot, Lieutenant Harold Haynes, wrote in his diary shortly before his death, "When I dive, I can hear her scream. It's not fear, it's fury. Every howl from the brakes is a curse we send to the Germans. If I don't come back, tell my folks the Apache sang loud for me." In early 1944, the Battle of Monte Cassino became the next test. The ancient monastery perched on a mountaintop overlooked the valley, the perfect fortress. For months, Allied assaults had failed to dislodge the Germans entrenched in the ruins. The A-36s were called in. Flying in through winter mist, they dropped bombs on artillery batteries hidden among the stones.
Each dive sent the sound of the screaming Apache echoing down the mountain, reverberating through the shattered abbey walls. Observers on the ground later wrote, "It was as if the ghosts of the dead monks were wailing through the sky." In 3 days, the Apaches flew over 400 sorties, suppressing enemy guns and clearing the way for ground troops to advance. The monastery would eventually fall, but it was the Apaches that broke the line of resistance. Even as newer fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang began to arrive, the A-36 still held its place. It was cheaper, tougher at low altitude, and trusted by the infantry that fought beneath it. To the men on the ground, the A-36 was not an aircraft, it was a guardian angel. When German machine guns trapped a platoon, someone would shout into the radio, "Get me the screamer." And within minutes, that metallic howl would roll down the valley, followed by the sharp crack of bombs and the silence that meant survival. By late 1944, the screaming Apache had left its mark across the length of Italy. From Naples to Rome, from Cassino to the Arno River, every burned-out German convoy and shattered bridge carried the signature of those screaming dives. They weren't the fastest, they weren't the flashiest, but no one, not even the Germans, doubted their precision or their courage. In a letter home, one infantryman wrote, "When you hear the scream, you drop your head and pray. But when it fades, you stand up and cheer, because that sound means the Apaches have come." The A-36 was beginning to show its age. Its Allison engine struggled in the cold air of the mountains, and its thin skin was riddled with bullet holes patched again and again. But the pilots refused to give it up. It was their ship, their weapon, and their warning to the enemy. A German unit diary captured in early 1944 summed it up best. "The American plane with the screaming wings attacks again. It comes low, like a hawk. We can neither escape nor answer. It is the sound of death." By the end of that bloody year, the A-36 Apache had completed more than 23,000 combat sorties in the Mediterranean theater. It had destroyed over 400 bridges, 2,000 vehicles, and countless artillery sites. And though it would never be as famous as the sleek P-51 that replaced it, the men who flew it knew the truth. Before there was glory, there was the scream. The Mustang's legend had begun not in dogfights over Berlin, but in the dive bomb runs over the mountains of Italy. And in every howl that tore through those skies, history could hear the birth of a legend. By the summer of 1944, the war in Italy had become a war of exhaustion. The Allies clawed their way north through mud, mountains, and machine gun fire. Each river crossed, each town taken, came at a cost measured in lives. The German retreat was deliberate, brutal. They destroyed bridges, mined roads, and turned every valley into a killing zone. For the men on the ground, salvation still came from above, and it screamed. The A-36 Apache had by now earned its reputation, a precision killer, low and fast, capable of dropping bombs on targets that other aircraft couldn't even see. German soldiers called it der schreiende Tod, the screaming death. Allied infantry called it the sound of hope. But to the pilots who flew it, the A-36 had become both weapon and curse. Every mission began the same way. Before dawn, crews rolled their planes out of the makeshift hangars, their skin patched with tape, the paint burned away by sun and dust. Mechanics fueled them from barrels and checked the 6 Browning machine guns, blackened from constant use. The pilots strapped in, adjusted their oxygen masks, and waited for the signal. The engines coughed, sputtered, then roared. One by one, the Apaches leapt off the dirt runways, climbing toward a sky already glowing red from artillery flashes on the horizon. Their targets were everything the enemy needed to survive: bridges, trains, fuel depots, and troop convoys moving north toward Rome. But this late in the war, the Germans were ready. They had learned the Apache's habits. They knew its dive angles, its attack patterns, and they had filled every valley with 20 and 88mm flak guns. The result was a duel of courage and inevitability. On May 12, 1944, near Monte Cassino, 12 A-36s from the 86th Fighter Bomber Group were ordered to destroy a German fuel dump hidden among olive trees. As the formation approached the target, the lead pilot, Captain Ed Rickards, saw black bursts blossom all around him. "Flak heavy, stay low," he shouted into the radio. The A-36s broke formation and dove one after another. The dive brakes opened, and the air filled with that now familiar metallic howl, the scream that had earned their name. The first pair released their bombs and pulled up hard. The second pair went in. One hit, one didn't. Rickards' turn came next. He rolled inverted and dropped into the dive. The altimeter needle spun like a wheel. At 3,000 feet, the cockpit vibrated so violently that his vision blurred. He released the bombs, pulled back, and felt the controls stiffen. Too much G-force, too fast. The bombs hit dead on. The fuel dump erupted into a fireball that lit the sky for miles. But Rickards never saw it. His plane didn't recover. The A-36 vanished into the explosion it had created. When his squadron flew over the site later, they found nothing but twisted metal and smoke. That was the life of an Apache pilot. Every dive could be your last. The A-36's dive brakes, so crucial to its accuracy, were also its most dangerous feature. A single hit could jam them open or closed, and if they failed to retract during pullout, the plane became uncontrollable. Many pilots died not from enemy fire, but from the very system that made their aircraft unique. One veteran recalled, "She was a killer to them, and sometimes to us." By mid-1944, the Apaches had become scarcer in the sky. They were being replaced by P-47 Thunderbolts, faster, heavier, and capable of carrying twice the bomb load, and by P-51B Mustangs, which could now reach Berlin thanks to their new Merlin engines. To the pilots who had flown the A-36, the replacements felt like an admission that their era was ending. They were proud, but exhausted. Their aircraft were battered from months of frontline service, engines overheated, wings cracked under the stress of countless dives. They had flown beyond their design limits and survived only through sheer will. But the Apaches weren't finished yet. In August 1944, as the Allies pushed north toward Florence and the Gothic Line, the A-36s were called upon for one last campaign, to hunt German convoys retreating through the Po Valley. They attacked from dawn to dusk, following dust trails and tire marks, strafing anything that moved. The Germans fought back with everything they had. Flak guns lined every road, machine guns fired from barns and church towers. But the Apaches came on anyway, diving, screaming, striking. A single pilot, Lieutenant Richard Dixie Dean, flew 87 missions in 3 months. He later said, "You didn't think, you just dove. The scream meant you were alive." Until it didn't. By the end of the campaign, Dean's group had destroyed over 600 enemy vehicles. Only half the pilots survived. To those who fought on the ground, the A-36's passing was bittersweet. They had come to depend on its terrifying efficiency. When the replacements arrived, the sky felt strangely silent. An infantry officer wrote in his journal near Bologna, "We used to hear them before every push, that horrible shriek as they came down. It was the sound of death for the Germans and hope for us. Now the new planes come, and they don't scream. I miss that sound." The surviving A-36s were gradually withdrawn from frontline service by late 1944. Some were used for training, others scrapped for parts. But for the men who had flown her, and for the enemy who had faced her, the A-36 was unforgettable. A captured German colonel, when interrogated about Allied aircraft, listed the usual names, Spitfire, Thunderbolt, Mustang. But then he paused and said, "There was another one, the one that screamed. We feared that one the most." By war's end, fewer than 100 A-36s were still airworthy. The rest had burned, crashed, or been stripped for salvage. But the aircraft had accomplished something few machines ever do. It had carved its sound into the memory of a generation. That unearthly wail, that mechanical shriek that preceded destruction, had become a part of the war's soundscape, as distinct as the siren of the German Stuka. Only this time, it was the Americans who had the screaming sky. In the quiet years that followed, pilots would still talk about it, that feeling in the gut when you pushed the stick forward and the dive brakes opened. That split second when the world tilted, the wind screamed, and gravity pulled harder than fear. They'd smile and say, "You never forget the sound of an A-36. Once you hear it, you know what death sounds like and what life feels like." By late 1944, the A-36 Apache's war was over, but its legacy had already taken flight. The lessons learned from its design, its stability, its handling, even the shape of its wings would feed directly into the aircraft that would carry the Mustang name into immortality, the P-51D. The A-36 had been the proving ground, the shadow before the legend. It was never meant to be remembered, and yet, long after its last scream faded, the world could still hear the echo.
The war moved on, as wars always do. By 1945, the skies over Europe belonged to faster, sleeker machines. The P-51D Mustang, powered by its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was escorting American bombers deep into Germany, dueling Messerschmitts at 30,000 feet. Pilots flying the new Mustang talked of altitude, speed, and range, of freedom and victory. But the veterans of Sicily and Italy remembered something else: the A-36 Apache, the low-flying Mustang that had screamed down from the sky before anyone had heard of the P-51. When the last A-36s were pulled from the front lines in late 1944, they were quietly parked in rows along airfields in Corsica and southern Italy. Their paint was faded, their fuselages patched with sheets of aluminum, their nose art nearly scrubbed away by sand and time. Mechanics stripped their engines for spare parts, their dive brakes frozen with rust and dried blood. There were no parades for them, no triumphant newsreels. Their work had been too dirty, too close to the mud. The Apache's victories had come in the shadows of the war, in the ravines, in the narrow roads, in the places where heroes had no altitude to hide. Yet the engineers back home were watching closely. In the factories of North American aviation, data from Italy began to pour in: flight reports, pilot notes, maintenance logs. Engineers studied everything the A-36 had done right and everything it had done wrong. They learned how its laminar flow wing gave stability in a dive, how its airframe could absorb punishment and still pull out at 400 miles per hour. They studied the stress cracks caused by repeated pullouts, the dive brake failures, the engines choking at altitude. Each lesson became a stepping stone. When they mated the Mustang's frame to the Merlin engine, the transformation was immediate. The new P-51 climbed like a rocket, soared where the A-36 could only crawl. The dive brakes were gone, but their aerodynamic heritage remained. Every P-51 that flew over Berlin owed its balance, its precision, its grace to the screaming Mustang that had come before. But for the men who had flown the Apache, the story was more personal. After the war, they scattered: farmers, engineers, teachers, men who carried the sound of the dive brakes in their bones. Some spoke of it proudly, others could never talk about it again. At reunions, they would laugh about how the Germans had mocked them at first, calling their aircraft the low Mustang or the clumsy one. They would fall silent when someone mentioned the scream. "You never forget that noise," one pilot said years later. "You'd dive, open the brakes, and it would start, a wail that went right through your skull. You knew someone down there was hearing it too, and praying it wasn't meant for them."
The A-36 had never been meant for fame. It had been a compromise, a stopgap between what America had and what it needed. But it achieved something far greater. It proved that the Mustang design could fight, survive, and win. Its kill ratio against enemy aircraft was astonishing for a dive bomber, nearly 12-to-1 in air combat. It destroyed hundreds of bridges, convoys, and strongpoints across Italy, and though official histories would barely mention it, ground troops remembered. Veterans of the Fifth Army would write home that the Apaches saved our skins. One officer described how, whenever his men heard the metal shriek of dive brakes overhead, they dropped their rifles and cheered. In war, fame often follows altitude. The A-36 had flown too low for anyone to notice. After the war, most surviving Apaches were scrapped. A few were sold to training schools, others simply vanished into scrapyards. Today, only a handful survive, silent relics in museums, their olive-drab wings outstretched as if waiting for one last dive. Visitors pass by them quickly, drawn instead to the polished silver of the P-51 Mustang displayed nearby. Few realize that without the battered machine beside it, the one with the holes cut into its wings, the one that once screamed across Sicily, the legend might never have existed. On the small information plaques, the A-36's story is summarized in a single line: dive bomber version of the Mustang, served with distinction in the Mediterranean. It is a modest epitaph for an aircraft that once made the earth shake. For the men who remember, that is enough. They do not speak of speed or glory. They speak of dust and sun and the sound of air tearing through metal. They speak of the moment the brakes opened and gravity took hold, that heartbeat before the dive when life and death balanced on a single note of screaming wind. And when they tell the story, their eyes always drift upward, as if they can still see it, the A-36, falling out of the sky like a blade, sunlight flashing off its wings. "We weren't heroes," one said quietly at a reunion decades later. "We just learned how to aim the scream." In the grand history of World War II aviation, the A-36 rarely earns more than a paragraph. But within those few lines lies the soul of something larger. It was the moment between failure and greatness, the shadow before legend. From its dives over Sicily to its runs through the valleys of Italy, it proved that courage could fly low, that precision could be born in desperation, and that sometimes the most enduring sound of victory isn't a cheer, but a scream fading into silence. Today, when the restored Mustangs of air shows thunder overhead, crowds look up in awe. Few notice the subtle design of the wings, the same wings that once held dive brakes, the same frame that once trembled at the edge of destruction. The echo of the A-36 lives in every one of them. And though its own name has faded from history's headlines, it remains whispered among those who know. Before the legend soared, it screamed.